computer. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for being here. This is our first webinar in a series of 4 focused on supporting English language learners. And, you know, this is kind of, we did a couple webinars in the spring when we all went online, but this is our attempt to take what we normally do in person at CAP onto the virtual stage. So, you know, we're all learning, and thank you all for your help in the beginning and getting this set up. Our focus today is, the title is Across the False Divides, Supporting English Learners in College Level Composition. And we have Jose Cortes and Melissa Reeve from Solano College. We'll leave the chat open so you guys can chat with each other. We will save some time for Q&A at the end. So as many of you probably know, it's hard to present and monitor the chat for questions. So while Melissa and Jose are presenting, you can use the chat just to talk amongst yourselves. But if you have a question for them, we'll ask at the end for you to put that in the chat at that time. So just hold on to that, or you can always type it in again. But those will come at the end. Like I said, this is the first in a series of 4, so we will have another one. When is the date? Let me double check before I say it. September 18th is our next one. Same time, Friday, 2 to 3:30, and that one's focused on the latest research around ESL students and placement. So I will hand it over to Jose and Melissa, and thank you all for being here.
Oh, sorry. Your graceful entry. Hi, it's Melissa. The slide here, Jose is controlling the slide presentation, so please bear with us as we try to coordinate. We, of course, are in 2 different locations, so we might not always be completely smooth in those transitions. So, in terms of the theme of this presentation, focuses on supporting English learners in the composition classroom. But starting with a little bit of context for the presentation is, first of all, why is this a more pressing concern now than perhaps it has been in the past? I think we've all long had English learners in our composition classrooms, but especially if you're in California, you're probably seeing a higher frequency of that now than you may have in the past. So since the passage and implementation of AB 705 over the last couple of years, one change is that students who were EL designated, you know, English learners in their high school may be entering transfer level composition sooner. In fact, in many cases, probably right away without any ESL instruction at the college level. And that is a data-supported decision. The RP group, after a massive analysis of data of California students, found that all US high school graduates are more likely to complete transfer level composition if they're placed directly into that course. Regardless of whether they were designated as ESL students or EL in high school. And so most colleges have implemented that, and that's the guidance of AB 705. So students who may have previously gone into ESL classes at colleges and had a long ESL pathway, sometimes even an ESL pathway followed by a remedial English pathway before making it to English composition, are going straight into those composition courses. For ESL instructors, may find themselves teaching transfer level comp in order to meet the needs of those students. And those transfer level composition courses might be formally designated in the English discipline or in the ESL discipline, but we're talking about courses that would transfer to a 4-year school as the freshman comp requirement. And then English instructors who don't see themselves as ESL instructors will see a larger number of students in their freshman comp classes who they would have traditionally thought of as ESL students, and are probably thinking about how to address those students' needs. Next slide.
This is what I think it's delaying just a second. I don't know
Oh,
why. Oh, there we went. See what I mean? So it might jump on you a little bit. If it does that, we're sorry. There's a little bit of a delay between the sharing and what's going on here.
Okay. And then in addition to the factors in the previous slide, another reason for addressing this concern now is that many credit ESL programs are restructuring to prepare students for that more rapid transition. So while some students who may be non-native English speakers are going directly into transfer level composition, others are still starting in an ESL sequence that feeds into composition. But those ESL sequences, because they feed directly into transfer level composition now with no remedial English courses in between, have been restructuring and retooling their curriculum to make sure that students are prepared for transfer level composition when they finish that ESL sequence. So as you can see, at this point in time, the line between ESL and English, such as it is kind of blurred. We have ESL instructors teaching composition courses. We have English instructors teaching courses that have a high proportion, potentially, of students who are non-native English speakers. We have students who may in the past have been designated as ESL and placed into ESL sequence going directly into composition. So it was with this in mind that we had this idea, our theme of the false divide, which is, in our view, and Jose and I have both taught English and English composition and ESL courses, and had the opportunity, as we'll show you later, to see students moving across the trajectory from one program to the other, sometimes in our courses, and we really came to believe that there's really not a divide between ESL and English. It's one that's been kind of structurally imposed by institutions, but it's not necessarily reflective of what students experience as language learners and as developing academic readers and writers. So some ways that we've historically divided English from ESL include the course content, what kind of materials and skills are taught in the courses in the different disciplines. Perception of students, who do we understand to be an ESL student versus who do we understand to be a college level reader and writer. The instructor training in the disciplines is different, such that ESL instructors, if you graduate from a TESOL program in your master's program, the focus is much more on the structure of the English language and also language acquisition and understanding that as a process, whereas instructors who have traditionally been hired into English or composition positions usually have their background either in rhetoric and composition or their MFA or some of those other backgrounds that haven't necessarily studied language learning as a process. And then departmental organization. ESL and English in some institutions are very separate departments, and in some cases historically have even been under different deans depending on the structure and the size of your institution. At our institution, ESL and English are part of the same department, and the two of us as full-timers in that program, as I mentioned, teach both disciplines, which has allowed us to have an active voice in our English department for forever, right? Well, I've been at the college 15 years now and been, part of both programs. But in many colleges, as we've talked to faculty around the state, we realize sometimes these two programs or the faculty in these departments don't even have opportunities to talk to each other and understand how their instruction or their expertise could inform one another.
So what we wanted to do to kind of illustrate this point of this idea of the false divide is Melissa and I have compiled some student work. We're going to be looking at a few different students. We're going to be giving you some profiles on these students, some samples of their coursework ranging from ESL courses up through second semester composition. So specifically looking at either intro to literature or critical thinking, like I said, our advanced critical thinking composition courses. So we're going to be going through sharing some different examples of student work, and then kind of talking to you about some of the takeaways that we have from being able to look at this work. And this is one of those processes that for us, like, you know, luckily we have some really diligent students who hold on to a bunch of their old work, because some of this we were able to pull from Canvas, you know, have access to type of that work, and other stuff we were able to just get from students personally. So it was a really nice opportunity for us to be able to go through student work, be able to look at growth over multiple semesters and analyze that. So the first student that we're going to be looking at is Titawan. I just want to give a little bit of her background. Titawan is a student in her 40s. She has 2 children, and she immigrated to the United States from Thailand. Her native language is Thai, and she was majoring in nursing. So her course history, she started Solano College. Sorry, I have to move this little window here because it's getting in the way. Eliminate that. There we go. Started Solano College 3 levels below transfer English. We have an integrated skills sequence, 3 of those courses, reading, writing, and grammar integrated skills, and they're 6-unit classes. So she started in our introductory level course in the spring of 2016. From there, she moved into our advanced course the following semester. This is one of those instances where we weren't offering the intermediate course due to low enrollment, so she made the jump straight into the advanced course, as many students were recommended to do at the end of that semester. From there, she enrolled in our CoRec transfer level English course, and then from there enrolled into Intro to Literature, which is one of our critical thinking advanced composition courses. So the first thing that I want to look at with her is we're going to look at a sample of her writing from the integrated reading, writing, and grammar ESL course. This is 1 level below transfer level. And specifically what I want to look at is we're going to be focusing on reading integration, and how she's able to take ideas from a source that we read and integrate them into her writing. Kind of going back to Melissa's earlier point about thinking about that in our pre-transfer level ESL courses, that we're making sure to focus on a lot of these skills that are going to be utilized and further developed in transfer level English coursework. So for this piece, we read kind of like in one of the collections, one of the ESL texts that I used that semester, it was like a truncated version of Malcolm Gladwell's idea of 10,000 hours, right? And in the highlighted section here, you can kind of see like, here's this beginning, starting to emerge central idea that she's presenting, right? So says that the word hard inspired me to give it a try and make me want to learn about golf. And looking through this introduction that she provides in the beginning, there's not really a mention of the reading, or there's not a mention of the reading at all, right? But we can start to see like this kind of beginning place where she's recognizing some of the key ideas that came from the reading a little bit, right? And starting to kind of move into this idea of like, can you do something and can you accomplish something if you put a lot of effort into it? So this is that really early stage of that like controlling idea for reading starting to grow, right? That we're going to watch, you know, as it's cultivated over multiple semesters and her language acquisition develops. So this next sample, this is from the following semester where she took transfer level English. And it's important to note that there are different instructors. I had the pleasure of having her in my class again for my intro to literature class, but this semester was with an instructor, a different instructor than me. She was in my integrated ESL class and then moved on to a different instructor's transfer level English course with CoRec support. So we can see that there's a pretty big jump within a month, right? Like the following semester, here comes her paper that she's writing in February, and now there's this awareness of introducing a writer, right? Introducing the essay that she read, the writer, kind of giving a little bit of an understanding of what the writer's point is. And then we can start to see there's a little bit more control starting to develop, that she's taking this idea, she's taking this focus on what she read about Gary Soto and his piece, and then kind of forming this beginning of this argument about how she's inspired for some of the issues that he overcame. That becomes more sophisticated the following month in the next paper, right? And we're seeing this idea that she's able to continue to ratchet up the level of sophistication as her tasks become more sophisticated and as time in the semester progresses. And now when we get down into this example that she gives of Jean Kilbourne, right? They're throwing in this argument, being able to look at what this writer is saying, and then providing a lot more sophisticated argument about worrying when children grow up, what they're going to think about the things they see portrayed as women as normal, right? So if you look at the contrast of those two examples to what was happening earlier on, just the previous semester, we can see that this writer is continuing to progress, right? Not only in their use of language, but then also in a lot of the academic moves that we're asking them to be able to do for the course. So this is same class. Now we're at the end of the semester. This would be her research project, I imagine, in May that she was writing this paper for. So once we get down now to the end of this introduction, and I'll kind of give you a second to look through that, I want you to pay specific attention to the highlighted area and look at how much more sophisticated her level of addressing a text, being able to form an argument based on the ideas that are presented in a text, and being able to have this really strong, controlling central idea that she's presenting at the end of her introduction. We'll have a second to look at that. And I think specifically, you know, like one of the things to stand out for us is like looking down here at the bottom, like to be able to say like, address this issue that there are these differences and they're regarded as this, like this gender inequality and discrimination, like being able to pull ideas, being able to funnel down into integrating the reader's ideas and use that to inform her argument is making tremendous development over the course of a semester. And then finally, we're gonna, there we go, okay, yeah, sorry. This thing's skipping on me. I just want to take a second to look, we're gonna be doing with each of our students is looking at their coursework over the semester. So starting from the left moving down, then center moving down, and right moving down, you can see the courses that she signed up for. We're going to be doing this with each student, and then what their grades were in each of the respective courses. And one of the things that we can see is, you know, there's some different things that are happening here, right? One of the things that was, you know, mentioned earlier on is her raising children, and there were some semesters where she had to withdraw from some courses, and having her as one of my students, you know, I know that it was due to kind of like family commitment, things like that. But one of the things that we're seeing is as she's taking some of these classes, right, and a lot of it, you know, algebra, things like that, maybe necessarily like I can't help with that in my ESL class, but as we're starting to look at like intro to public speaking, American cultures in film, right, we're seeing the language development that she has and the different coursework that she's taking is sufficient for her to be able to do well in the courses that she's taking, right? We're going to see that kind of reiterated again and again with the different samples of students that we look at.
All right, so I'm going to talk about a student that I met named Helena. Again, you can just sort of see her background. Helena had kind of a disrupted experience. She was first at the college shortly after immigrating from Afghanistan, but she had 3 kids around the same time, you know, in her early years. So she was taking ESL classes at the college. At that time, our program was discrete skills, different from the model that we teach now, but she was in and out of those classes in the early years while she was, you know, starting her family. And she attended part-time and intermittently from 2005 to 2010, just taking ESL classes for the most part, maybe a little bit of math. And then she was out completely for 5 years, but she came back in 2015 around the time that her kids were probably getting into their teens and more self-sufficient. She enrolled full-time, and she started in our advanced integrated ESL course. She was on the borderline between a C and a D at the end of that semester, and I asked her what she wanted to do, and she said, I want to take this class again. And I said, okay. So I gave her the D at her request so that she could take the class again. And she did great the second time, and from then she just thrived. She went directly into transfer level composition, and as you'll see when we get to her grade record, she went on as a full-time student for the next 3 years, took all the classes, and finished her AA degree in accounting in the spring 2018. So this was from her second attempt in that advanced integrated reading writing skills ESL class that she took with me. This is writing that she did. We had been reading The Giver, and you can see that here she's working on sort of, again, text integration, how to incorporate ideas from what we've been reading into supporting her idea in the writing. And so I've got a couple things to focus on. The underlined bits are places where we can see kind of disjointed or lacking transitions to clarify the connections between the text and her own thinking. And we can see in the green highlighting where there's a quotation just dropped in there, right? Again, just kind of no transition. So on the plus side, she's beginning to make the moves of referencing the text, using direct quotation, citing the author name and page number, right? Those are all skills that we want to make sure that we introduce and that students get to start practicing as soon as they can. But we can also see that there's not as much cohesion in the writing here as we would want to see when we're getting on to the transfer level. This is a paper that Helena wrote in her transfer level composition course, and I was not the instructor. So she did this with another teacher. She gave this paper to me later when I was asking for work in preparation for this talk. And I love this paper because, and I love this assignment. And every time I see it, I think I gotta tell that instructor who gave this assignment how awesome she is. But in this case, she's writing about the myth of Persephone and relating it to what she's witnessed in her home country of Afghanistan of forced marriage and punishment of women who resist forced marriage. And so we see this juxtaposition between this very clear summary of the text and honing in on a specific point of the myth, and then connecting it to a news piece from CNN about a woman being punished for refusing a forced marriage. This is a continuation of the same paper, and you can see that whereas in the work that she did in the ESL course, one level below transfer, the semester right before this, now we see the connections that we were lacking in the other paper, where she's using these phrases like talking about Rakshana, the woman from the CNN piece, and this phrasing like Persephone, she did this, right? We see this nice repetition where we see the rules of man, period, rules that were set and carried out, right? And then we see the phrase, as for her mother. So in all of these underlined places in this text, different devices she's using to connect ideas between the text and to connect her ideas one to the next. So the cohesion is really there to a much greater extent. And we see how much skill she's developed in integrating ideas from the text and synthesizing them with other sources. So then Helena was out of English classes for a little while, I think while she was working on her accounting courses and other requirements. And so I did have the pleasure of having her in my class again in literature and critical thinking, which is our second semester transfer level course. And this is an essay that she wrote analyzing a poem, Woman to Child. And I wanted to include this example because not only, again, do we see, how nicely she's able to write summarizing and responding and analyzing text, but also the green highlights here, we can see how she's adopting the vocabulary that's specific to the task of analyzing poetry. So we see her referring to stanzas, referring to symbol, We see her citing the text by line, right? Line 2. So those I just felt are really nice moves and demonstrate how students are able to learn and adopt the language that's specific to tasks if we make sure that we are being very explicit in teaching the language that's specific to tasks that we ask of them. This is more from the same paper. Again, we see her talking about symbol, stanza, imagery, and so on. This is a complete record of Helena's coursework starting from fall 2015. You'll remember that she had some earlier time at our college, but this is from the time that she began to attend full-time. And you can see that with the exception of a little bit of trouble in algebra and geology, she made it through a great variety and diversity of courses, statistics, music, you know, economics, all kinds of courses that she needed to do in order to complete her AA and get her accounting degree. Jose, you're muted.
Thank you. The dog barked, so I had to mute myself super quick and forgot. All right, so last student that we're going to look at is Han. So give a little bit of background on her. Han graduated high school in the United States in 2016. She finished her junior and senior year. Her native language is Vietnamese. She's a chemistry major, and she transferred to UC Davis in the fall of 2019 to pursue that degree in chemistry. So she started in our one level below integrated skills course. And then from that class, she enrolled in accelerated English. So she was in my integrated skills class. And at the end of that class, through a portfolio assessment, I recommended that she go directly to transfer level English, but she chose to under enroll and take our accelerated English class. We actually interviewed her for a presentation that Melissa and I did some years back. And one of the things that she talked about is she said that I felt like I was possibly ready to go to transfer level English, but I didn't think I was ready to go to that class and for sure be able to get an A, right? And so when you're thinking about, like, you know, she talked about like her want to transfer to Davis in a very competitive field like chemistry, where you need a very competitive GPA to get into that school. She chose to under enroll because she knew, she said, she'd be able to get an A in accelerated English. And then with that extra preparation in her mind, that extra preparation would be securing her to be able to get an A in transfer level English as well. And then after taking transfer level English, she enrolled in our critical thinking composition course. So we're going to look a little bit at introduction development, specifically focusing on central idea, right? So in this first piece from her integrated skills class, right, she's bringing in our writer's argument about kind of looking at other people's opinions and not instantly dismissing those opinions as dumb or stupid or you know, being dismissive of one's ideas because they counter to your own. And we can start to see this beginning of her putting forth her argument, right? Like, here's what this writer says, but I don't agree with his points, right? So really straightforward argument, understanding what the writer's ideas are, and then thinking about what her stance is on that specific issue. As we start to move on and start to look at the introduction development the very following semester, right away, I mean, one of the first things that we see is like the structure, right? I mean, the way that the paper is set up, the way that the paper is introducing the source that she's reading, right? This was my class, and we were reading a section of Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, The Trouble with Genius, where we're looking at like specifically parenting philosophies and to what extent does a parent influence a child's sense of identity. It's pairing that with some different texts. And one of the things that we can see in the very beginning is she kind of like presents an argument early on in this first highlighted area, right? So like looking at that early on, she's like, I feel that personality impacts my parents mostly, right? So friends start thinking about how they're impacted by their parents and thinking about the result of like why she feels that way. And then throws in this Gladwell idea that he presents of LaRose showing these two different parenting styles. And when she gets down to the bottom, like she's kind of presenting this idea of like, well, maybe it's not as clear as what she thought it was, right? And I think that's a really cool move that's starting to emerge that she's making, where it's like, we're presenting, here's what I originally think about this idea, and now here's how my perception on this idea, or maybe my viewpoint on this idea is starting to kind of change or become a little bit more critical because I'm being informed by some other outside sources, right? And once she gets down into like the end of this thesis, like being able to say that, you know, each of them are able to accomplish something because of this, and kind of look at both the positive and the negative, or the potential kind of like good points and bad points about these two different parenting styles. So she's allowing for there to be like some complexity in her ideas, that it's not just I agree with this idea or disagree with this idea, but that maybe there's some sort of like in between and middle ground. And we're going to start to see this idea of counter arguments start to emerge in her writing. So this is now getting ready to look at the following semester when she was in our advanced composition critical thinking course. Actually looking at a very similar, this is a different instructor that she had for this class, but a similar topic, right? Where they're thinking about parenting, and you can start to see that she's now going to be kind of using that reading, right? Using what a writer is saying about a specific issue, specifically like parent wanting to control their kids, and maybe some of the fears that drive those parents to feel that they need to have that type of control over their children, right? That she's pulling in the writer as a means to be able to kind of, I don't know, present her rebuttal to what the argument is of parents saying that they need to be able to control their kids from, or keep their kids safe from things like abduction. Finally, when she gets to the end, to this last highlighted section here in the introduction, she says that they're learning how to take responsibility for their decisions. And the important thing is that parents have a balance of giving privacy within protecting their children. So she's really like being able to set herself up. And as we look later on into this paper, as the body paragraphs would progress, you can see that the level of sophistication that she's been able to develop over the course of these couple semesters is now setting herself up to explore counter argument, right? Being able to set up to come from a place of solely, do I agree or disagree with this issue, to a point of there's nuance in there, right? That there can be some benefit to looking at something this way, that there can be effective counter arguments. And that in this case, you can establish a counter argument, but show that maybe that argument doesn't have as much validity as one may think that it does. So really just looking at, again, that development, the way that she's pushing through those introductions, and specifically the way that she's setting up the arguments that she's going to be making over the course of just, you know, this, 3 semesters that we've been looking at her progression, that level of sophistication is ratcheting up significantly. So when we look at her coursework, right, again, like to the point that Melissa was making earlier with looking at Helena's work, as the semesters that she's taking integrated ESL class, she's taking courses where she's, you know, these are courses like American culture and film, women in American history, right? Looking at some of these classes, like these are very writing heavy classes. I'm specifically the professor who teaches the women in American history class. Like that's a class with a very heavy, you know, writing load, writing significant essays, and she's doing very well through these. I mean, she had a little trouble in cellular and molecular biology, right? So maybe that's one of those places that I failed her, that I could have done a little bit more to pick that, to cover that in my English classes. But you can see that like Han's language development is not in any way, shape, or form impeding her ability to be able to succeed in these courses. And I think that's one of those things that's like really important, and was so eye-opening for us as we started looking at this, that last piece of the puzzle, to think about like, well, how are these students doing right now? That, you know, we'll talk about this later on, that we have this need, and kind of thinking about this idea of the false divide, to say that everything has to be at like this kind of mastered level, right? That like in order to be able to move from here to here, that there has to be like these set of skills. And of course we have our learning outcomes, and we recognize that that is true to an extent, but that also, you know, as we start looking at some of the takeaway from this, really thinking about this idea of language development as a continuum, and that throughout these different checkpoints, that her language development, and the same thing with all of these women who were looking at their samples that they're writing, is adequate and beyond adequate in places where they're able to be able to apply it into other facets of their education. can kind of segue into Melissa's section on this.
Building on what Jose is saying, like the reason, you know, just sort of the big takeaways we really felt that the student work affirms for us is that students' growth isn't finished, right? That idea of a false divide, like that a student somehow finishes ESL and is ready for composition classes, or that a student finishes composition classes and is now a college reader and writer and able to move forward. It's really not consistent with the continuum that students experience. It's not that their language development or their reading writing development is finished at one level and now they're ready to do the next thing. It's that at each level they're learning language that they need to apply to the task at hand. Students' milestones in development of language or other reading and writing skills won't always be aligned with transitions that we have imposed between course levels or between ESL and English or anywhere else that we might draw a line. And what we can see with each of these students, especially, you know, as we highlighted, sometimes the very short time span, just a period of a couple months or from one semester to the next, which also is just a couple months, right? In a student's work, that we could see huge leaps in terms of what they were able to do. And part of that, of course, is instruction and practice building student skills. But part of that is also that students rise to the occasion, right? We don't have to front load all the language skills because we find that students are able to learn language, both whether that's vocabulary or whether that's you know, rhetorical strategies. They can learn language just in time in order to apply it to the task at hand. Each piece of student writing that we looked at is a snapshot in time. And as we look at students writing as snapshots, we need to ask ourselves, does their English and their control of English rise to the level of the current task? And we focus really on that question, and why current is in italics, is to remember that in supporting these students, we need to think about what we've asked them to do in that moment and what instructional support we've provided to enable them to succeed in that moment, and not worry too much about whether what they're able to do in that moment is enough for what they might be asked to do in 3 or 6 months, right? Because as we can see from these students' work, what they were able to do was enough in the moment, and a couple months later when they were asked to do more, they did. Many times in my career, I've heard colleagues say, you know, from looking at a snapshot of student work, whether in our department, we used to have, in our English department, we used to have an exit exam that students had to take to move between levels of, from remedial to, or developmental to college level composition. And people would look at that snapshot, that one-timed essay, and say, this student isn't going to make it in the next class, as if looking at that snapshot was predictive of what the student would be able to do 2 or 3 or 5 months later, right? And we really don't want to see things that way. We really want to think about, hey, what were they able to do today? And then how are we going to build on that to what they need to do next, rather than saying what they do today is not going to be enough 4 months from now, therefore I'm not even going to give them that chance. So now we want to move to talking about inclusive practices and you know, basically how do we support English learners in our composition course? And I'll just cut straight to the chase and say that you know, a lot of these things are actually teaching practices that benefit all students and not just English learners. So first of all, when we're selecting text, when we're selecting the readings that our students will do, it's always beneficial if we can select topics that allow students from different backgrounds to be put in a position of expertise. And so, of course, a variety and diversity of texts, so that students who may, for whatever reason, whether it's because they are from another country or, you know, whatever their background difference might be, can be put in a position of expertise and feel that they have cultural capital, that they know something because of their unique background that actually allows them to contribute to the group in a way that other students might not be able to. So topics that address diversity, that include immigrant experiences and immigrant voices, are different ways that you can provide a way in for students who might be questioning whether they belong in the composition classroom to say, oh, this writer resonates with me. This is an experience I can relate to and that I can speak to. But also, our students have expressed to us that as immigrants, they don't always want to only read about other immigrants. They also want to read what they consider to be sort of classic American texts like Steinbeck, or also, of course, about current events and cultural conflicts in this country, which is important in order to become fully engaged members of their current communities and society.
So one of the other strategies to do is think about reading comprehension, right, as one of these inclusive practices. And it's really important to think about the need to build schema, right? And this is not just true for English language learners, but this is true of all of our students, right? That maybe some text that we're reading will require a certain amount of American history, and that could be one of those places where we may need to front load something or provide a supplemental text to be able to establish some of that context. Same thing with thinking about recent current events, right? That if we're going to be, like for example, one of the things that we had shared in previous presentations is that Melissa was teaching the new Jim Crow in one of her co-rec English classes, and it was specifically advertised for multilingual students, and then it being a great mix of multilingual students and native English speakers, and that there was this situation where working through that text required a lot of the discussion of American history, a lot of discussion of current events, to be able to make sure that that was one of those things where the students had the schema to be able to access the text, right? That we were able to create that situation where there was that support, that structured support to be able to provide students with that context. And then cultural references, and I'll share an example. And I think this is also really important to think about, not just for, places that our students are from, countries that they've lived in, but then also thinking about that with age. And I think that's really important for me too, when I think about cultural references, when I'm talking to students. And, I'm constantly reminded, especially in fall semesters, when people are like, oh yeah, I graduated high school, 2020. And I'm like, I'm getting pretty old, right? And it's like, so that's kind of one of those things that's like mutually beneficial, to really kind of open up our classes and think about these situations when we think about flipping kind of that like power dynamic of a course, right? And being able to get a situation where people are able to have this information capital in so many different ways. And a lot of that has to do with the different types of references that are being made. That there are those times where we'll be looking at a text and maybe something a little bit more modern is referenced, or something I've read, certain texts where other countries are referenced, and a student from that country in the class or who speaks that language, for example, using Gloria Anzaldúa's How to Tame a Wild Tongue, like that's a great moment for my Spanish speakers to become people in positions of expertise. So really kind of thinking about this idea of being able, not just that those references, but being able to find a situation where we're building context, but sometimes it can be students in our classes who can be the ones that are helping build that context. And I think that's one of those things that's really great right now. I'm sure, like many of you, like I'm entering this semester with a lot of feelings of like apprehension about thinking of teaching in a modality where I never saw myself before, right? Like, I mean, I just like, even delivering this in front of people like through a computer is just, it's a modality that I feel very uncomfortable with, like, at first. But I start thinking about like, what are a lot of the strengths of this? Like, and in this case, people are able to attend more so, or in classes, one of the things that's a massive strength is that we provide a situation where students are able to learn from each other in maybe a way that they otherwise wouldn't have, right? And a big part of that is shared writing, using our discussion boards, things like that. So really kind of thinking about like there's this situation where cultural references can be defined, and not just by us and by supplemental readings, but by students that are in our classes, and really kind of thinking about opportunities for vocab study also. And this is something that native speakers will also need as we're starting to approach, different topics where we're being introduced to, jargon or languages specific to a specific reading that we're looking at, or just building those vocabulary and context skills. So I want to share an example of an assignment that I did this semester that my students are actually working on this week, and it's building context through understanding allusions and references that are being used by a writer. So kind of the way that I went through putting this assignment together, is I created it as a discussion. The reason that I created it as a discussion through Canvas is I wanted students to see the work that other people were doing. I wanted to kind of create like a running document of different references this writer is making in the prologue to his novel. And so started off by kind of going through and narrating through a slideshow and kind of talking through some points in a content page that I created, where I define allusions. I provide them with different sources of allusions, right? Different examples of common references, whether they be, literary or cultural, thinking about pop culture, biblical allusions, different things like that, to kind of show the different places where references can come from. And then move in from there to being able to define allusions within authentic text, right? To be able to take that skill set and apply it to the reading that we had that week. So it started with this, right? And this picture looks super duper awesome to me. And this statement couldn't be any more true, right? Like, I know that, I don't know, many people right now are like, I was like struggling with wanting to eat everything once I was home all the time. And plus, like, my kids have the most delicious food, right? Like my freezer, like I've been on like trying to be a healthier eater over the last several months, except for I live with a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and they eat just awesome stuff all the time, right? And so if I make this statement and I say ice cream is my kryptonite, like for the most part, this is a term that I could just drop this allusion, give this reference, and people know what I mean, right? They know this is something that weakens me. And it's assumed, right, to be able to start with something like this and be able to start with this reference with my students this week, that we're all kind of on the same page because we have referenced that same cultural allusion, right? That we all know that Superman is weakened by kryptonite, and that's about as far as my knowledge of Superman goes, but I do know that reference, right? And so to be able to make a statement like that is one of those things to really think about, that for some of our students, whether it be because, they're developing as language learners and maybe they haven't lived in this country that long, or their age or the region that they're from, or whatever the case is, like there can be these references that we tend to think as very common and just one of these things that we drop regularly that may be lost in the reading. And so I think that's especially true when we're looking through specific texts, right? Is that there's going to be instances, specifically the example that I'm going to give, where writers will make a lot of references, assuming that the target audience, in the same way that we would in conversation, or the same way that I would have in this awesome picture of ice cream, just tend to gloss over without checking in to make sure that students are listeners or our audience has an awareness of that reference. So this book, I'm using the prologue to this book. This book is amazing. Thanks, Summer, for this reference. And several of us have read this book and are using this book. This is called Saigon by Phuc Tran. It's a memoir about his experience as a Vietnamese refugee moving to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is a pretty rural area. And what it was like for him kind of growing up, and how he used, his love for literature and his moving into punk rock and skateboarding as a way to be able to kind of escape the ridicule of being the immigrant to being an outcast, and kind of redefining who he is. And so here's a section in the prologue of his book. He has tons of references, and they're quick, and they're everything from Dorian Gray to Morrissey to even just saying what a punk rocker is. I was talking to one of my students earlier this week during my office hour, and I asked her, I was like, well, what does he mean when he says he's a punk? And if she thinks about it, she's like, well, I just know punk as in like they're a bad person, like they might be out to like hurt people or bother people. But then I was like, okay, well, let's Google a picture of like 1980s punk rock. And then, you know, you see the big mohawks and the dyed hair and things like that, and the spikes on the jacket. And all of a sudden her context changed, right? So in this passage that I selected as the example that I used for my students, he references both Frank Lloyd Wright and John Hughes, right? And so right away, as soon as he talks about like kind of this craftsman blueprint, this John Hughes, right, of teen malaise, it's like, it's expecting right away, and this could be something for language learners could be difficult, but then also to like the 18-year-old kid who's in my English 1 class right now, I don't know if I say right now, what's your favorite John Hughes movie? Instantly 16 Candles. That's by far my favorite John Hughes movie, but I don't know if that reference is going to be caught in the same way, right? And so this activity was really helpful to be able to build on that. And so what we did was a few things. They started a discussion post where this is just a sample taken from my Canvas page of the discussion, copied down some context where they found the reference, right? So just enough so the reader kind of knows where or how the reference is used, right? To have a little bit of context on that. Then they're just supposed to kind of do a little bit of research, right? Dive into, in this case, John Hughes, right? Like I would maybe Google John Hughes, see what kind of movies he made, maybe even watch the trailer for one of the movies or look at some pictures and kind of think about like understanding this reference as much as possible and really stressing this point that a lot of times this isn't something that you can look up in a dictionary, right? This is something that's going to take a little bit of digging and being able to build that context for yourself as a reader. And then finally, and I think this is kind of the most important part to think about, is how does that understanding of that illusion affect comprehension for you as a reader? So beforehand, if it's, you know, John Hughes is something that you gloss over, Frank Lloyd Wright is something that you gloss over, how then does going back and taking the time to critically read through that passage again and understand that reference affect the meaning of the passage that Tran is presenting, right? And so I wanted to include an example. I thought this was really awesome. Like I said, my students are working on this right now, but this is one of my students' posts that he made this morning. So this is Dang. Dang is international student from China. And here's a sample of what he pulled. And the illusion that he selected was Funhouse Mirror. And again, I think this is one of those examples that's great, right? Like I know maybe like John Hughes or referencing, you know, Dorian Gray or something like that can be a pretty obvious one. But then Funhouse Mirror could be one of those things that could be very easy for us to gloss over, right? And so he picks this section where he talks about transperception. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't understand why it just wants to move on its own. Transperception of himself when he looks at another there's another kid who moves into the class who's also an immigrant. And when he sees that kid, he talks about him being this kind of like version of himself that he's seeing, that he gets a funhouse mirror view of himself. But if we look at Dang's analysis after being able to dive in to see what that funhouse mirror meaning is, it's really cool what he's able to do in this discussion post, right? I mean, specifically when he talks about like, you know, he wants to hide his identity as an Asian and tries to integrate into American society. He forces himself to forget his original mindset and lifestyle. And then when this new person comes in, right, he almost succeeds. And then he sees this kid Hong and he looks at him as kind of the same way that he viewed himself. Like, I mean, there's just this really awesome moment where like Dang is able to dive into this cool, deep understanding of how Tran feels about himself as the way he sees himself reflected in another immigrant kid. And so I just think this is a nice opportunity to be able to, you know, instead of kind of glossing over some of these references, taking the time to go through and critically read through these and build this skill and being able to recognize illusions when you see them as a means of unlocking deeper meaning in text. So last thing I'll before Melissa goes on is talking a little bit about class discussion and really kind of thinking about situations. And I talked about this a little bit before, where we could create opportunities for people to be in that position of authority or be in that position where they can share prior knowledge, right? And really thinking about that like low stakes collaborative practice. And I think that, you know, in the same way that, you know, last time we were all together, you know, for those of you who were at the conference, we're talking about doing a lot of these things in a face-to-face context. But I think there's a lot of moments where we can really be able to apply this to the current situation that we're in with, you know, many, if not all of us, teaching online, right? And thinking about this situation of how do we apply a lot of this low stakes collaborative practice. And one of the things that I'm starting to observe, and I don't know if it's the same or if maybe you're having some of the same conversations with your students, is that because of everything that's happening, and specifically like where we are in California, you know, it's a very hectic beginning of the semester with school closures and fires and things like that. Like students are already entering the semester with a lot of feelings of anxiety and apprehension. And I think that one of the things that's happening is that's also being compounded. Specifically, I spoke to 2 students this week who were in my previous ESL class last semester, who are now looking at discussion posts and the conversations that students are having and the samples of writing that students are producing and feeling intimidated by that, right? Having that notion that like, here's how people in the class are writing, and I'm a little worried that I'm not going to be able to write at that same level that they are, right? And a lot of times carrying those feelings of doubt that many people have as they are acquiring a language that I have with my second language, right? And I think is a very familiar feeling. But I think there's a lot of great opportunity to kind of really think about how to create these low stakes situations and how to kind of really flip those feelings of anxiety. And I'm still kind of developing this idea as I'm encountering it this week for the first time, and thinking about this as an option for like really creating this culture of being able to share and develop ideas as a community, right? And being able to break up into small groups and have these opportunities where we're able to learn from each other. And I think this is one of those things where, you know, for the most part, yeah, we do, like when we have our classes, like for my class, like I have, you know, some different peer review moments, and students will come in and they'll share sections of their essays, or they'll share golden lines from things that they're reading and stuff like that. But a lot of the writing that they do is submitted to me directly, and it's something that I read with them. And there's some smaller moments of sharing text with each other. This semester, and in the online modality with discussion posts and all these different shared instances of people putting their writing out there, that's one of those places where, like I said, if people are thinking about they're approaching it with feelings of apprehension of seeing other people's work and feeling intimidated by that, I think there's this really great opportunity to instead start thinking about this shared work, these Canvas discussions being kind of like this informal context to be able to the beginning of the writing process. And we've talked about that before, about like when we're creating assignments, to think about the things that we're doing are shared, the ideas that we're generating at the beginning of the writing process, right? So really kind of thinking about how we can change that to these moments of like developing ideas together, and that we're learning from each other. And it could be a situation where students learning from somebody else who has a completely different schema than they do as they're moving through a reading, or maybe kind of being able to model some of the writing styles that people are doing in their posts.
Jose, can I chime in something on this slide?
Of course.
Yeah,
I'll go back.
You know, it's interesting. I think that the way that discussions play out in an online course, and I'm talking about discussions, I know there's like more tools now that students might be like in a live discussion where they're actually speaking, but I'm talking about discussions where students have to post, right? Post something and post a reply. On the one hand, you know, Jose is talking about how that can cause some students to feel apprehension if they're seeing the work of their classmates and feeling like they're not ready yet to produce work like that. But I also feel like those types of moderated discussions can also be an equalizer in terms of students' ability to contribute. Because, for instance, in a live discussion, as we all know, no matter who the group of humans are, right, there will always be talkers, and there will always be people who sit back and don't feel comfortable or don't feel like they have an opening. There are people who will talk over everybody and not even notice that they're talking the whole time, right? I mean, all these dynamics play out. Whereas in a discussion where each student has to post once and reply once to somebody else, suddenly the opportunities to contribute to that discussion are completely equalized, right? Mm-hmm. And there's not the opportunity for one person to dominate the discussion. And so our non-native English speakers are sometimes the students who are feeling reticent to contribute to a conversation, even when they might have the most valuable thing to contribute, right? But in a discussion post where they have the opportunity to think it through, post, maybe even check their language, because students often feel more comfortable writing and having a chance to go at their own pace and proofread and look up words or whatever they need to do and put that post up, they're able to do that and not feel like either the moment passed by or that a stronger speaker was dominating the time, and that they never got to say anything. So I think that's a potential advantage of online discussions for not only non-native speakers, but also for people who are just usually the ones who are more reticent to speak up.
The last part thinking about is thinking about this idea of backwards design, right? This is something that, you know, is constantly echoed through different presentations through CAP. And really thinking about like every activity that you're working through, right? Like whether it's a discussion post, thinking about references in a text, thinking about, you know, the reading activities, pre-reading, post-reading, building analysis activities, that it's always kind of being developed to work towards that larger goal, right? That larger goal being this specific piece of writing that's going to be generated, right? So that idea of backwards design is that everything that they're working through, and I think that, again, kind of going off of what are some of the strengths right now that we have, you know, doing low stakes activities before, like in a formal, like in a face-to-face class, I would have done things like creating posters and things like that to be able to do. And it's like, we can hold on to those and students would take pictures of them and I would bring them back and forth from my office into the classrooms. But I think now, going back to like Melissa's point about a lot of the strengths of the discussions, is these are preserved for the semester, right? And as students start kind of forming these ideas with each other in this pretty informal, kind of relaxed context of having these low stakes discussions, they're also developing some really significant ideas that they can explore in their essays. I think that's one of the really great places where this online adaptation can be really helpful as a pre-reading, or excuse me, as a pre-writing activity, as students are kind of really working through and processing through ideas. I had a previous discussion where we're focusing on like pulling some golden lines or some big important ideas and explaining why that idea stood out to us, you know, to each individual student from the reading, and people were commenting on those different ideas. And there's some amazing, just like kind of seeds that can be just cultivated into some great ideas that are going to be coming forth in upcoming essays. So I think this is, again, one of those great opportunities that we have to take the modality that we're in right now and be able to use that with that backwards design kind of philosophy in mind about how to move forward with writing assignments. All right.
Jose, Melissa somehow got booted out. So
okay.
She's not sure what happened. She's working on it. So if you could just
sure.
Take her
she's getting ready.
if you don't mind.
Yeah, one of them focuses specifically on her class, but I can go in and kind of explain this concept of growth-oriented feedback as she's coming in. So I think that, you know, really kind of thinking about the way that we're giving feedback, right? And thinking about the samples of the student work that we gave early on, like to help inform this idea, is one of the things that we want to make sure that, like, you know, we're keeping in mind in the feedback that we're giving to students, right? To really not conflate this idea of entry skills with exit skills, right? That like where students are, you know, that was one of the things to think about, like before, when like a student would leave an ESL class, right? And I know that one of the things we've talked about in previous presentations, that feeling of like, as a student leaves our ESL program, kind of going on to the idea of the false divide, like, are they at that level of mastery to, if they went into a colleague's, you know, transfer level English course, it would be like, this person in ESL did their job to get the students prepared for this class. And so I think it's really important that as we're thinking about, you know, starting to frame this idea of growth-oriented feedback, that we're not saying that entry skills are the same thing as exit skills, right? So when we're thinking about this student starting transfer level English or being in this class, is not the same thing as saying, can the student do the things that are required by the end of this class? And I feel like oftentimes, at least for, you know, some of the conversations that we've had at my campus, that starts to kind of be the way, right? Like, oh, this student might have difficulty being able to write this research paper. Well, of course, it's the very beginning of the semester. We're not expecting them to be able to do that. And if you look back earlier on at the samples that we gave, I mean, that level specifically with looking at Titawan's growth over looking at a month to month, watching her through transfer level English, I think that really kind of provides that support to that idea. When we're giving feedback in students' writing, focusing on less on what's wrong and more on what to do next time, right? I mean, one of the things that, you know, I know we've all talked about this idea of like having this growth mindset and making sure that like the feedback that we're giving, I feel like we're assessing and we're giving feedback on the things that we value. And this is one of those moments where like we talk about the writing process and we talk about how important that idea of growth is and how important that idea of learning from you know, maybe previous areas where we could develop or mistakes or whatever we want to call those things, that's our feedback should also reflect that, right? That the way that we assess things should be reflective in philosophy that we have of what's important as we move forward with our students writing. And I think also one of the things that can be really helpful and especially specifically powerful for students is this positive modeling, right? Sharing examples of strongest students' work from every assignment, and how it aligns with whatever the target is, if you're using a rubric or whatever, the kind of like, you know, breakdown of criteria for success for a specific essay. And I try to cycle through this as much as possible. So I don't look at like a specific whole essay. I mean, there's times where I may do that, but a lot of times when I do this positive modeling, I might look specifically at like, here's a really strong introduction, and let's talk about what makes this introduction strong. Or here's one really great example of quote integration, right? And look at what this writer did. And so at this opportunity, you have this place to be able to showcase as many writers as possible, right? And really trying to create a situation where over the course of the semester, maybe everybody in your class or a vast majority of class has gotten to that example of positive modeling. And in the situations that I've had, especially for a lot of those students that kind of come into our classes with those feelings of self-doubt of, I'm not a great writer, or this is something that I'm not good at. And then you say, hey, if I can model this moment in either in front of the class or even in my office hours, right? If I look at a place, I'll be like, look at where you framed this quotation, or look at where you gave this writer's ideas and how you provided analysis to that. If you can do this here, then you could do this anywhere else, right? Like kind of proving that like that the student is capable, or that writer is capable of making that move. Now let's go through and let's find other places where you could recreate that. So I think that positive modeling, whether it be sharing the work with a class or just sharing the work with that individual, is a really nice opportunity. And specifically, you know, when we're in this online modality, it's one of those instances where we can like grab things from discussion posts, throw them in, and pasting, like kind of showcasing the work that people are doing. There's a lot of art in that. So this right here,
Melissa's back.
Okay, let me
Thanks,
go.
Jose, for carrying the torch. As he's moving to the next slide, I'll just chime
I don't
in
know,
a little bit.
something weird happened. Hang on.
Okay.
I have no idea what this just did. Try. This whole sharing is really weird. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
I'm just gonna you talk and I'll go to your slide.
Okay, well, we're moving on. Here we go. There we go. So talking about positive modeling, and you'll see me reference it here too. You know, I think many of us probably do class workshops where we show student writing that maybe is not quite meeting the target or the goal of the assignment, and workshop it and talk about ways to strengthen it. And I tend to do a lot of that, and I still do some of that, but I feel like over time I get more bang for my buck out of sharing positive, you know, positive modeling, instead of showing work that isn't what I'm looking for and talking about why and thinking about what it would need in order to get there. Actually just sharing the very best work and talking about why it's great, you know, and how it meets the, you know, the expectations as aligned in my rubric. So that's a strategy I've adopted more and more, and students have expressed that they really, that it inspires them and makes them feel competitive, that they want to, and they feel like, oh, my classmate wrote like that and I can too, and I want my paper to be chosen. So they start aspiring to being a, you know, best in class type of example. This is an experiment, and I'm just putting it up here to think about how do we do growth-oriented feedback in an online environment, because this semester, you know, teaching in Canvas, I've often used more portfolio-based grading systems, or a lot of assignments where students just got credit or no credit, and then like grading rubrics for essays or things like that. But working in Canvas, of course, I have to keep an up-to-date grade book that shows students' grades in real time, and which is a numeric and mathematical system for grading. And so that's something that I don't always have to do. And in fact, many years ago, when I was first involved with CAP, I said, I was very excited to break away from a mathematical grading. But Canvas requires it. So I had to think about how to incorporate this idea of growth-oriented feedback or even grading. So this is a scale that I'm trying this semester for formal writing assignments. It's a holistic scale. And I am doing this in more of a portfolio style where the first time that students turn in, and this is for their formal writing assignments. I have a different scale for their sort of little day-to-day discussion posts. But in this case, when they turn in their major essay assignments, the points values are really low. And this is an idea that I got from a colleague who's reading a lot about grading scales and how they impact students' perception of their work. And we know that many grading systems, like if your essay is worth 100 points, then there's like all these, like, well, why is this one 79 and not 80, right? And so this is a more holistic type of rubric that really looks at, does the work that students have turned in show skills mastery? Does it show strong skills, or does it show that the skills need more practice? And the growth-oriented part of it is down at the bottom, where it talks about, like, if you look at the strong skills, it's my feedback's intended to support your growth toward mastery, right? And if you look at the needs more practice column, it says, look at my feedback and look at the best in class examples. So I'm referencing that and reminding myself of the intent to do positive modeling so that this student could say, all right, I need more practice. What do the successful papers look like, right? And then later in the semester, students will be choosing one of the essays that's scored according to this system to revise, and it'll be worth more points toward their total grade. So in this case, students are getting 4 points just for turning in a complete on-time assignment, and then 1, 2, or 3 to look at where they are in the trajectory of skills growth. So it actually shrinks down the difference, right? It's like you got 5, 6, or 7, right? It's not you got 70 or you got 90, So the way that works out mathematically is that students wind up getting about half their points from formal writing and about half of them from the day-to-day assignments. And then within the formal writing assignments, they get more points toward the assignments that are revised at the end of the semester. Whereas the ones when they first come in, they're just on this simple 3-point scale that's added on top of the 4 points they get just for doing it. And so my goal with that is to keep their focus on practice and growth, and to take their focus, to shift their focus away from how many points did I get, while meanwhile having their grades still track in real time in Canvas. So I can't promise you that this works, but what I am sharing is just sort of an effort of how to incorporate this growth-minded grading or feedback principle into an online grade book. Finally, because we're talking about language learners, there's always this question of, well, but they make all these errors, and instructors sometimes share with us, well, I feel like I need to mark everything because the student needs to know. But actually, research in language acquisition will show that marking everything is not helpful for students, in addition to being immensely time consuming for instructors, right? You really need to look at students' work and think about comprehensibility. And are there a couple of language patterns that they seem to be, a couple of errors that they're making repeatedly that are interfering with comprehensibility, right? And focus on those and let some of the little stuff or the one-offs, let those things go, especially if they're not impeding, the comprehension. Just as people who learn a language as an adult will tend to speak with an accent for the entire time that they use that language, we also see those kind of accents in student writing, but it doesn't actually help to keep correcting them, right? All that it does is demoralize and distract students from the actual intent of really pursuing higher order skills of critical thinking, writing, and development. So if you are going to give feedback on language, sort of standard language, standard English features, really limit it to a couple of areas where you can demonstrate the pattern that a student needs and show them several places in a piece of writing where using that pattern would improve the clarity of their writing. And finally, building on that same idea, we really need to think about what is good enough English in 21st century California or United States, knowing what a high proportion of our students are immigrants. And just actually the language variation that exists among English speakers, even who've spent their whole life in this country or in English speaking countries. And there is language variation. We need to honor that. And we need to honor it in our classrooms the same way that we do in our regular daily lives when we're out and about. And maybe we find that, you know, our doctor or the person who prepares our taxes speaks with an accent or emails us using, you know, English structures that might look different from our own. And yet we totally gloss over that because we respect that person's expertise and that person's intellect for getting to the position that they're in. Well, the students in our classrooms also have expertise and intellect, and are sometimes, because they're in our classroom, the power dynamic is shifted and we think like, oh, they're here because they need to improve, right? And we're sort of in the authority position and evaluating that person only on the basis of their control of kind of a standard of written English. But we really need to ask ourselves instead is their English and their control of English rising to the demands of the tasks? And as you could see in all of the student writing samples that we have shared, including the last example Jose put up that his student just wrote last night, right, his student from China, you can see we were focusing on what was working well in that student writing, but those were authentic student voices, and there were structures in their writing that would be different from the ones that I would produce myself, and yet they were rising to the challenge of the assignment. And so we need to remember that, and I should mention, to the challenges of other assignments in their classes across many disciplines that they were studying. So we need to remember that, you know, these students, English is good enough. They're doing the things they need to do to be effective college students, and we don't want to get too hung up on the little things that distract us and really think about the big things that are going to make them successful as students.
We can move
That's
into
it for
Q&A
us,
now,
right? So
right,
we have
Tori?
a
Yeah.
little time for questions. We didn't talk all the way through, did we?
We have about 10 minutes
Oh, perfect.
for questions, so we can type them in the chat.
Okay, are we looking at the chat or are you looking at the chat, Summer? Let's see.
We can all,
I guess we can all look at it.
So managed to get permission to show student work. We actually reached out to the students personally. So these were some students that you know, we had multiple semesters, and I just called them up. Like one of the students, Han specifically, her family owns my favorite Vietnamese food place in town, and I've had like several of her cousins in my class and her sister in my class. So like I know them, very friendly with them. So it was just a issue of like reaching out, you know, and either seeing them on campus or giving them a call and just asking them for their work. And they were super happy and brought the work in. And I think that's one of those places, like when you kind of talk about why you're getting the work, and then I shared it with them. I showed them kind of the stuff that I found later on. That I know students are really excited to be part of that, right? To know that like their work samples are helping other, you know, students in their same situation.
Let's see. See the student's first language is helpful instead of a barrier. That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, in our district, the diversity of students' first languages is extreme. So this can vary. You know, there are some colleges where there's really a clear majority of students coming from a single language background. But as you could see, even in the examples that we shared, we have students. Solano County is one of the most diverse counties in the entire country, actually. And so we don't have courses that, you know, explicitly connect, you know, a language background to English. It's certainly a point well taken, but at our college it would be pretty difficult to do because sometimes there's just one or two people in a given class who come from a common language background. See, people are working on the idea of informed consent. That's good. Yes, common themes. Absolutely. That is something that California Acceleration Project works on. And I can, you saw Guillermo Coles come up in the chat earlier, another very CAP influenced program. We usually work on developing curriculum for each, whether it's ESL courses or composition courses that have kind of a core text and then build themes around it. And I mentioned Guillermo and the program at Coyamaca because they have several thematic courses developed and curriculum around specific texts that for levels of ESL that they make available to instructors at other colleges. And then the Acceleration Project has, maybe Summer can speak to this, has I think a list of course themes that have been developed by participants in the CAP community of practice over the past few years. And so absolutely a thematic curriculum is a great way. It really dovetails nicely with language development because students get a chance to kind of read and think about a topic over and over, and they're building the language as well as a familiarity with some of the different voices and arguments around that topic over time, month by month and assignment by assignment, instead of each unit being something brand new.
Yeah, we do have that list. It's grown to, I think it's like 100 pages now because we keep adding to it every year we do the Summer Institute. So it's on the CAP website, I believe in the publications page. I'll look in just a minute and drop the link in the chat, but it's a really great resource for, you know, building ideas. And we have, I would say it's heavy on the English side, but there are quite a few ESL course outlines in there as well. And it's really helpful to just get those ideas and see what's out there. And all of the instructors in there who are sharing their themes are part of CAP's leadership program, and you can reach out to them. I've had several people email me over the years asking to see the actual essay assignments that are outlined. So you can feel free to reach out to the people who have shared their outlines. Do we have any other questions? Anyone want to add in the chat?
People are just ready to get on with their Friday, huh?
Yeah.
Such as it is. I feel like between being in, sort of COVID working from home and then working online on top of it is like really exacerbates the sort of 24/7 feel of like how days blur into days and weeks blur into weekends. And it's just sort of like, you're just always,
yeah.
You know, it's so weird that it's like 3:30 on a Friday afternoon right now. I'm just like, here I am.
Thank you all for being here on your Friday afternoon. And I mentioned this in the chat, but we recorded the webinar, and we will put that and the slides on the CAP publications page. I will be sending you an email in just a few minutes with a follow-up survey. So if you could take a minute, it's a quick survey just giving us your feedback on the webinar. Thank you so much for being here. We hope to see you in a couple of weeks at our next session. And I think that's it. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.